we've had many discussions over the years. I haven't been here for all of them, but they certainly, it's a recurrent topic about the case definition for CFSME. I certainly understand why this is important at many, many levels. I think the entire advisory committee agrees that this is not a problem, an issue that we can resolve around this table. And there are many disparate thoughts about how to go forward on this just within our small group. And what I am proposing is for us to come up with a working plan on what we can do as a committee to move this forward and where we need to end up. And I want to have y'all kind of give me a little bit of leeway for at least a bit to see if we can come up with what I call an action plan to move this particular topic forward. And at the end of our action plan, we have what it is that we want. And so I had volunteered to lead this discussion, and Marty and I, within the Office on Women's Health, have been working on a process, a strategic planning process, and we are using action planning, a specific action planning technique to move our office forward in several things. So what I would like to propose is that we try to use this particular method today and come up with some ideas about how we can move this forward. And then what I'm thinking, and if this is a bad idea, we can revisit it, but I'm thinking these could be tasks and things for the subcommittees to do research, to do actions on over the course of the next months, so that this would really give some direct tasks and strategies to our two subcommittees. And if we need another subcommittee, we can certainly create another subcommittee. That's not really an issue. So that we can come up with some plans. And if this ends up needing a meeting at NIH or CDC, so be it. So that's sort of the thought that I have. And Marty is going to help me with this because we've both been using this process. But the first thing I would like to get clarified is at the end of this process of getting a good case definition, not at the end of our process, but what is it that we want to have at the end of the process? What would be our ideal? What would be our goal, the big goal? And because I think we need to know what that is first, and then we can see how we're going to get there. So for those of you who, yes, Steve.
Now, I'm wondering if we could take up the primer first and then go to that, because that's a long discussion. Well,
the primer is our here. The primer, I thought we were going to let on to begin at 3:30 when we had our committee discussion.
Fine.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Fine.
I'm just trying to stick with the agenda.
One point.
Yes.
It would be very useful as a member to get the agenda and the materials ahead of time. We have in the past meetings gotten those, and then we get a chance to study them before we walk into the meeting. I just would appreciate that, and I know it's been done in the past, so I'm hoping we can do it, because we had them emailed to us like a week ahead of time in the past.
The agenda, actually, we tried this time, Steve, to do our best to prepare that several weeks in advance, so you did receive the agenda.
I was in trial, so I might have
Right,
missed it.
so you hadn't received it. We always try to get the agenda out as quickly as possible, but the materials, we have had an historical perspective that when we send the materials, we used to have duplicate materials because people didn't always bring the materials. But we'll do our best to see what we can do about that.
Yeah, I think
advanced materials sometimes get left at the office, and when people travel, we were told that sometimes we have to duplicate them here.
If they're sent electronically, then you don't waste the paper, and people can print them.
Well, the agenda has been sent electronically.
Right. I was in trial, so I must have missed the email.
Right.
Thanks.
And it's also been posted for about a week. The agenda? No.
Actually, 2 weeks.
Yeah, the agenda has also been posted.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's regroup. What I would like is for the goal, Susan.
Yeah, I was hoping to just throw out some remarks and see
Please.
what the rest of the group thinks. I think, just based on the last few years where we've been talking a lot about case definitions, the Fukuda case definition and the Canadian case definition, I think we may need at least two case definitions. We may need a research case definition that is useful, where we really have to be careful in terms of characterizing patients for research purposes, and then kind of a working, perhaps for clinicians and those types of people who see patients, more of a clinical case definition. And there's probably going to be a lot of overlap, but I think in terms of the rigor that we're applying with each of those, maybe some differences. But I think so far I foresee at least two, possibly having two case definitions.
Does the the clinical case definition, is that the one that would apply to things such as Social Security, disability?
It might.
Or is the research?
Yeah, that's right. It might, or just making a diagnosis in a clinical setting, or deciding on treatment options. It's probably a little bit more fluid than than perhaps the research case definition.
I just remember, I think Amanda was talking yesterday that Social Security has a definition that they use. So I'm just wondering which definition would be used for Social Security, if they use one at all. Do you know, Elaine?
Well, I can't speak for the Social Security Administration, obviously, but just from my knowledge of it. Generally, there is a diagnosis, but they don't, case definitions are not really used per se in the Social Security determination process. There would be the diagnosis, but then they would evaluate disability based on function.
On function, okay.
And,
I have a question for Susan. Would you characterize what you just said as a clinical algorithm, maybe? Would that be a better description than, strict case definition? Some kind of guide or algorithm?
What I'm thinking, as a clinician, I often try to, but fail. And like you're caught up in the patient's narrative as they're talking to you, and it's sort of like a, for lack of a better term, kind of your hunch or your best guess that this is what the patient has, based on just listening to the story and certain elements coming together, laboratory data. So you don't really. The clinical diagnosis, I say, is more fluid and it may not meet every single criteria at that moment. But as I said, with the research definition, I think it has to be more rigorous.
I just remember as a clinician, which was a long time ago, that I had these, what I would call case definition, clinical definition of lupus, of rheumatoid arthritis, that the American College of Rheumatology developed, that we all as medical students had, that said if you have 3 of the 5 major and 6 of the 7, is that what a clinical one would be like?
Something like that. But like you said, we have like seronegative lupus, yet you still feel in your heart this person has lupus, just because they're missing positive, anti-double strand. That doesn't mean that they don't have it, and so I think it gives you a little bit of wiggle room in terms of what your clinical judgment is.
Anne?
Yes, so I was going to refer to a clinical definition is a little bit different from an algorithm. I think an algorithm leads to a clinical definition, or a clinical definition can dictate an algorithm. So for fibromyalgia, now in 2010, there's new criteria. There's clinical criteria, and then there's a research definition, a research criteria that was modified from the clinical criteria. So I'd say we could use that as a model. However, the difference between fibromyalgia and CFS is that fibromyalgia is not a condition, a disorder of, that it's not a diagnosis of exclusion. I think CFS, the problem that we face in clinical practice, and I'm speaking for myself, is the confusion regarding exclusionary conditions. It's just, it's really difficult. So I think the algorithm would help with trying to sort out some of these questions that clinicians have, and also, what is the appropriate initial diagnostic workup? I think that's also rather confusing.
So just, we may be getting into the discussion. What I would like, let me bring us back to this thing. What is it at the end, not of today, but at the end of this process? What is it that we want to end up with, Lisa?
Just from a new member's perspective, and it may stir up the hornet's nest a little bit, but from the new member's perspective, in order for me to get my head around what we want at the end of the day, I kind of have to have a better understanding of what the problems with the current case definitions are, so I know what we are wanting to change. I mean, I know there's dissatisfaction, but can somebody articulate that
Jordan, you want
for the newbie?
I can try. Although I think there are a couple of papers that are very helpful here from Lenny Jason, who actually worked on this in the past, I think. So I think there are several definitions, and people have been talking about this over the past couple of days and over the past meetings. So there's the 1994, I think, Fukuda definition, which is the one that's being used most widely, and I think it's a set of research criteria, basically, which kind of became de facto the clinical criteria that were used for diagnosing chronic fatigue syndrome. And I think there's been a more recent set of criteria, so-called Canadian criteria, which a lot of people have proposed should be used in lieu of the Fukuda definition. And it's kind of like a little bit difficult to really summarize all the work that people have done over the past 20 years in 2 minutes. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. But I actually wanted to go back to what Susan was saying earlier and just say that and just echoing what I think Anne was saying, that, and going back to your question as well, which you asked in the first place. So at the end of this process, the way I actually see this is, I think that what would probably be helpful for the clinicians is just having a definition of what chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis, or myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome really is. I don't think we'll be able to only have that sentence the way we have it for, let's say, having an acute myocardial infarction or another condition that's so well defined. So I think that we'll probably end up having, the way at least I see it, is having a sentence, which might be a very long sentence, of what chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis is, followed by a set of exclusion criteria which should be met, and then we as a committee can actually, depending on our discussion, we can probably specify a certain number of major and minor criteria, the way you were referring to during lupus.
I would like to offer a cautionary note to
Right.
that, is I don't believe that this committee should be the only
That's another
people to do
question,
this. So I think what I see our role is to lead.
Sure.
We don't have to say who's doing it right now. We need to say we want to get it done, and how do we get there? And I think it would be very presumptuous of us to be the only people to do
Right.
that. So let me offer this. I think our goal is to have a widely accepted definition that is used throughout the United States, the clinical community. To me, that is a bigger goal and a one that gets us further along.
To establish also a common language about the disease. I think that should be our goal, so that, I think, again, going back to what Susan Ann was saying, and I think everyone around the table, is that when we actually recruit those patients for those studies where we're going to look for biomarkers or for treatments, we actually know that we're talking about exactly the same patient rather than, different patients, or patients with broadly saying the same condition but maybe different subsets that might not be effectively.
Steve?
Yeah, Anne mentioned fibromyalgia, and I think that's instructive. In 1990, they passed, a group of rheumatologists got together and set up a set of criteria for research purposes. It wasn't very long after that that those became clinical criteria. In practice, the clinical criteria didn't work because they were keyed to tender points, and for research you wanted 11 out of 18, and then somebody would meet it on one day, and then 6 months later they'd only have 7. Do they still have fibromyalgia? So the alternate criteria that were put up abandon the tender points and make it totally symptom specific with the scoring system for several categories of different problems. So they divide the body into 19 parts. If you have 7 of 19, then you only need 3 points, and if you have 3 to 6 out of 19, you need 9 points out of the other things. I mean, the issue is broader, though, because if it is strictly a self-reported condition, then you begin to enter into the legal world where benefits for disability claims are going to be limited to 24 months instead of age 65. And a lot of times when the criteria are thought of, those kinds of things are ignored. When the fibromyalgia, if the fibromyalgia community truly has abandoned the tender point exam, they're going to undo 20 years of litigation and take fibromyalgia people and kick them off disability benefit claims because now they're all self-reported because it's all symptom-based. So this is something that underlies a lot of the goals. The goals are to have a research definition so that you can study the same patients and at the same time have one that works in clinical practice. And there's the challenge.
Jacqueline?
I suppose I had a question. So would it be that the committee is thinking about rehashing the whole definition and reinventing the egg as opposed to just picking the Fukuda, the Canadian, or one of the ones that have already been proposed and already been hashed, you know, throughout the years by many people?
See, I don't see the committee making this decision.
I don't see the committee having the responsibility of rehashing the egg when people who are involved and been involved in over the years have hashed it.
If we could come up with a process that at somewhere along the line we had a big meeting where we brought a bunch of people together. This is what I'm sort of thinking. And we could find funding from around the table here. Not necessarily this part of the table, but that part of the table.
You're looking at the gorilla.
Yeah, but I'm also looking at our public-private partners out there. So if we could come up with because what we have to do, I believe, is come up with a way so that just like the American College of Rheumatology came up with definitions for rheumatoid arthritis and lupus, well before there were some biomarkers then, but there was lots of, you know, I trained a long time ago before we had a lot of this stuff, and that was a public-private partnership or of some sort. It may have mainly been the private partners. That's what I'm seeing at the end of our process, and so I want to figure out how we get there. Eileen.
I agree with you, Nancy. I was going to say, what about a series of conferences, 2, maybe 3, I don't know, however many you think is needed, where the government sponsors
and our clinical partners,
and we, you know, and it's inclusive. It involves everyone from all stakeholders: medical, academic, scientific, private, advocacy. All the communities are there, giving input. And whether they decide it's creating a new research definition plus a new clinical definition and reaching consensus, and from that point forward, all governments, all private institutions, everybody uses the same thing so we get on the same page about what this disease is, and we can begin to replicate studies. If we can sponsor a conference like that, it would be great.
To me, that's still not the goal.
more?
A conference or 2 conferences.
How-
That isn't a goal.
The common language is the goal.
Yeah,
So
but
what-
to,
so I
sponsor
still
the
wanna
conference
I
to
still
get,
want to come up with the goal.
like if you had the conference, wouldn't that be where you accomplish that with the language?
Yeah, so what is the goal? I want to write the goal.
Oh,
I
see what
I
you're
have
saying.
my form.
Oh,
That I'm.
you want the, you mean you want the exact wording of this?
I want the wording of our goal. What are we striving for?
Is this a recommendation you want, or is it coming in form of a recommendation to get
Not yet,
this?
not yet.
I think what we want is to find common ground among clinicians. We want to find a way to define a heterogeneous group of patients to the satisfaction of both clinicians and researchers, but with the caveat that, when biomarkers do become available and they're replicated and we feel that they're quite reliable, that we can add the biomarker as a feature of our case definition.
Let me just try something. Is our ultimate goal here to have case definitions, if we can come up with different wording there, case definitions, and I make that plural, that are suitable for research and for clinical use, that are widely accepted by many types of providers and insurers and whatever around the country.
Yes.
Is that a goal that people could like to get their arm around?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So the next thing is how do we get there? And Terry and I had a great this morning conversation. Can you get just a little bit about what we talked about, which is sort of how we can learn from other disease entities in this process?
Sure. First off, I want to compliment Dr. Levine because I think you've hit the nail on the head that, research definitions are sometimes more restrictive than patient definitions.
Right.
Common example, COPD. Every clinical trial of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which people think they know what it is, although I'm not too sure, requires you to meet specific FEV1 pulmonary function test criteria. However, I can tell you I see many patients in clinic every week that don't necessarily meet those criteria, but I'm quite sure they have COPD. And they may have other comorbid illnesses that mess up their pulmonary function tests. So that's just one example, but I think it fits in a heterogeneous disease like this even more so. With that said, we have to be very careful with our research studies or we'll end up with a mess at the end, which doesn't help anybody. So the question is, how do you get to a research definition so that you have the basis to proceed with drug trials with confidence that, you're kind of all looking at the same thing? And people have said to me, Nancy said to me, okay, Terry, so how does the FDA define a new disease? And the first thing I said was, well, FDA doesn't define a new disease. What happens is that the community, and I'm being very inclusive here, defines the disease. And typically there are consensus panels by some of the physician groups, so like the American Thoracic Society or the American Rheumatology Society, or so forth, that defines these panels. Now, in this case, we're kind of at a disadvantage because this disease doesn't quite have a medical home. And so I think as we begin to build consensus around these things, we need to think about being inclusive of some of the physician specialty groups that might have impact on this disease and be very inclusive of them so that when more consensus is reached, and maybe not reinventing the wheel, maybe consensus is around something that's already out there, but it's accepted very broadly. And then once there's broad acceptance, the FDA can look at that and we can incorporate the ideas that work for research as part of our guidance documents. But typically, our guidance documents are based on the consensus that's out in the field. An example, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Recently, there's an effort to try to define endpoints for that disease. That's another horrible, awful disease, lung disease, where people die in about 3 years. And the problem is, how do you define endpoints for that? And we don't really know. So they came to us and said, what endpoint should we use? And we had some ideas. But what happened is that a physician group in the American Thoracic Society got together and worked on endpoints in a very inclusive kind of a way and published a paper on it. And then we can go out to pharmaceutical companies and refer to that paper and say, look at this is what's out in the field. So there's ways to get things kind of moving forward, and I totally agree with Nancy's idea as well as what you said, that we need to be very inclusive about this, but in particular we need to engage the physician society groups, because until you've done that, you're still going to be this fringe stuff that nobody quite agrees with.
Yes,
just tagging on to what you were saying, I think that I know of an example of a process like that, and I think going back to the MAP network, the multidisciplinary approach to pelvic pain that was sponsored by the NIH, I think that discussion actually has been ongoing for 4 years. So I don't think it would only take a conference or two to be able to do that if you're really trying to be inclusive. But maybe that's the road to success, at least the way you were describing it.
Yeah, that may be a
Right.
kickstart, and I totally agree with you. This is not going to be a one-shot deal will come out at the end of a conference and be done. We're still probably going to be talking about this 20 years from now because our understanding of the disease is going to evolve. I can tell you that, we've known about COPD for a very long time, and physicians are still talking about how do we better define this in research? How do we better define subpopulations? There's a huge NIH-sponsored study going on looking at exactly that to facilitate drug development. So this is kind of like cleaning your house. It's one of those things that's never done, but you get to a better stage and a stage of improvement.
So a conference is one way to move the discussion along a little bit. A conference is one way, or set of conferences is one way to get to the goal. I'm trying to be 21st century and think about perhaps there are some other more modern mechanisms where we could have discussions, and perhaps somebody like Phoenix Rising could give us advice on web-based discussions, or other groups, but that might be another path to the end, and perhaps faster than conferences once a year.
Right. Yeah, Eileen?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. My only concern is, and I do agree that it's an ongoing process and we'll always be refining the definition, but what's so concerning to patients is decade after decade, it's almost one step forward, 2 steps back, and not to rehash or pick on the CDC, but with the empirical definition and things like that come along, it does set us back. So there is an urgency to really attend to this.
That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, we want to move forward, and even if we're moving forward takes 10 years, as long as it's a moving forward without those steps back, I'm cool with that.
Go ahead, Ernie.
Yeah, first, just dispel a myth. The CDC case definition, Fukuda, and the other variations that came out of it were not designed for clinical practice. I think everybody should understand that. They were designed specifically for epidemiologic research. Nobody believes that the physicians should wait for 6 months, for example, before they start treating the patients, which the Fukuda and the other definitions specify. But you have to draw a line somewhere for research and for epidemiologic studies, and that's what was done. Is it a perfect case definition? Everybody could argue on that. I personally, it would be very challenging to get one silver bullet case definition.
I don't think we can.
For CFS. Always there's a give and take for sensitivity and specificity, and that would be our challenge going forward.
But I mean, look at the lupus ones.
Right.
I mean, those to me are the same issues. We shouldn't stop because of that kind of difficulty.
Right.
We should come forward with. I see lupus as a great model here.
There are 2 points that I wanted to make before I have to. The one is supporting what Teresa said. It's always crucial to involve the physicians' associations. If we're intending this to be for physicians to use them, we have to put it in a situation where the physicians will have a buy-in in that process. And one of the ways to do that is involving the physician association groups. Everybody would benefit from that. That's one. And two, I believe this process should be data-driven. In other words, we should not be creating a case definition in a vacuum. It has to be supported by data. And that's one of the reasons we started out the project in the 7 clinics, that's 7 sites. What we're basically doing is we're going to the physicians in those 7 clinics, and we're asking them to use their best judgment, not any one case definition, but to use their best judgment to diagnose a patient with CFS and collect as many data as possible to help us then step backwards and try to characterize the heterogeneity of the disease from those multiple sites. And I believe data like that one should potentially inform the discussions that we will have in the future.
Yeah.
I see a parallel here in the history for this particular illness with respect to another one that I'm familiar with and did research on for a number of years, and that's fetal alcohol syndrome. So fetal alcohol syndrome started out being defined over 30 years ago. A very specific set of criteria, very specific indicators, no biomarkers, no tests except the very specific ones that were placed into criteria. The problem as the field developed, and so researchers kept, or the clinicians kept seeing these kids, and then they would talk to the animal researchers and the basic research scientists and say, here's what the kids do, can you model this? The animal people would model that and take it back, and they'd say, well, how can you use these types of therapies and these types of things with the children, and then how can we intervene earlier? And so there was this feedback. The feedback eventually led to the reclassification and redefinition, and it's now fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, because they've added additional things that will be that are required for a definition. Because what was happening was the children that were not quite had fetal alcohol syndrome by definition were missing out on critical services. And so that led to a further refinement, if you will. It was a broadening of the category, but a further refinement of the research in order to advance that field. And they're moving much faster now. In the past 10 years, this field has moved much faster than it did in the past 20 when I was involved.
And I would like to ask, would another part of the goal, we said one that's widely used, would it be that we have a different name? I mean, if you wish, you can only get what you wish for.
Are you talking about the name for the disease?
Yeah. I mean, they changed AIDS. It used to not be called AIDS.
I know.
It was a name change here too.
The name change is one of the hottest issues for especially the patient community. Everyone's concerned about it for many reasons.
Would you want to make that a goal?
That would be a great goal. I'll be there.
You can only get what you wish for, and you put down on paper. And I don't know if that's too hard to get at the same time that you get the case definition, but you can only think about it.
Yeah, they're tied in. I mean, those are the things that are tied in: ICD, name change, case definition. They're all interwoven. So it would be, I think, an appropriate time to have that dialogue and really consider getting the name changed.
And that could be data-driven.
Right. Yeah. Anne?
I think a data-driven name case, well-characterized case definition with the right name will also take out a lot of stigma that patients face and, the provider community faces.
So these are all really good suggestions, and I think this is framing and context. So how do we get there? And how do we as a group of just a few people get there? What can we do as a committee? Steve?
We read Lenny Jason's article and look at it carefully because he proposes an ME definition. Unfortunately, the one in our packets is every other page.
Okay.
I printed out a full one.
So how do we? So that's one step. So how do we get to? Getting to a definition? And again, I don't think we just want to advocate for Lenny's definition. I think we have. Let me just say, we can't do this, I don't think, without the physician and other provider community. They have got to have buy-in here, and so.
Go ahead.
So I think we definitely Lenning's paper is part of it, but
it's a very good history of the development of the different criteria and a comparison of the different criteria, along with a proposal that probably would function pretty well today. So I raise it in that context.
Okay.
It's a process, and even if we would recommend something like this today or next year or whenever we choose to do it, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be more discussion about it and more change in it. The problem is somebody's just got to grab the bull by the horns and do something.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. So what will we do in the next 3 weeks, in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months as a committee? We have subcommittees. We can get action. Elaine.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise one, question in regard to the process. I really appreciate the points that Teresa and Marius made about bringing in some of the physician groups and getting that buy-in. The challenge, I think, with that, given the lack of medical home that you referred to, is the learning curve because those groups that we want to help bring to consensus are also the same groups that we're talking about sending the primer out to because they don't have much knowledge of this. So I'm not saying that's a reason not to bring them in. I'm just saying I think that's one of the things that we need to think about in thinking about process.
Probably one of the.
Say it's like a catch-22.
But you go and we're doing something like this in our office around screening for interpersonal violence. We're organizing a meeting. We are writing the letters right now with the big primary care providers to come learn about how one screens for interpersonal violence in a primary care clinic setting. So you just go and you educate the leadership of each of those physician groups, and then you start working with them.
Probably the way to go to get to that point or to get to the goal, I think the way at least I understand it is for us probably to recommend that we initiate this process of engaging the different patient organization and going along with what Beth was saying earlier. I think the way we can do that is we can engage into an ongoing discussion, which doesn't have to be happening only twice a year, but we should set, I think, definite goals and time points at which there should be progress reports or evaluations at least, let's say, every 3 months, and definitely at every meeting of the CFSAC committee twice a year.
I think, Marianne.
Well, I can tell you that there have been hundreds of committee meetings about the name change for chronic fatigue syndrome, stretching back year after year after year. And I've never been in one in which anyone really thought that chronic fatigue syndrome was a good name. And if this group has any meaning at all, I personally think that we should send forth a recommendation. This may be the wrong time of the day, but we should recommend that the name be changed to ME, and that then what happens to that after we make a recommendation, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem to be very fruitful. But at least we've done what our only choice is to make a recommendation.
See, I personally think we have more in our toolbox than that, because I think that, to me, the most important thing is the case definition, and I believe that the name can fall from there. You have no idea, I get emails all the time, and one of the big ones I keep getting is, ME, do not put ME in there. It's different. You know, it is different than CFS, and do not. So, I mean, it's not, you know, is that the best name? I don't know if that's the best name or not. So, but that would be my advice. Now, you all are able to recommend whatever you want. I can't vote. So you can make a recommendation, but I personally think that the name would come along with the case definition, and that could be a process, again, that we involve more than just the few of us around the table. That's my thought. Susan?
You could ask the clinicians, for instance, who are involved in Ermias' study, the experts, clinical experts, and ask them what they feel should be the main criteria of a case definition. Just try to poll as many experts as we can internationally and try to come up with a consensus that way.
Steve?
I know that as long as I've been sitting on this committee, in the 20 years I've been working with chronic fatigue patients, it's just been a very difficult issue. And I think that I feel like I'm a clone of Lenny right now, but he has a case definition for myalgic encephalomyelitis and a very well set up set of criteria. So the question I would have is this an acceptable approach? Rather than say, well, what do you think it should be? Let's start with something tangible and send that out for review and concerns. Because if we start with what should it be, we're setting everything back 20 years.
I mean, it's sort of a straw man that you have that you can put up and let people.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
And it may be the straw that turns into a nice hut.
Right. Exactly. Jacqueline.
Well, that's my reason for saying, let's look at the most favorable criterion out here so far, which is the Canadian. I thought the issue between the Fukuda and any other definition is that you want to exclude depression as patients with depression being included in a definition of being defined in patients with chronic fatigue syndrome. You want to separate the depressed patients from the patients who have myalgic encephalitis, and that was the issue. And the Canadian criteria emphasized post-exertional malaise, which would allow for that definition. And rather than go back and start all over again and waste of time, start with something that does that to some degree already, which would be the Canadian, or start with, I'm not against starting with this template, but to start from absolute scratch all over again in a disease which isn't settled with a specialty. There's no one specialty that owns it. That it's going to be hard to gather the quote-unquote experts to come up cold with criterion. Again, when we have the Canadian, we have, or this to start with, we have things to start with rather than rehash all over and end up 20 years behind. Because the reason for having a case definition is so that we can start having meaningful research. If we can't have meaningful research, we won't progress. And it's true, it may change over time. The definitions may change over time. All the diseases, the definitions change over time. But if you don't start with some meaningful research now, you won't be able to define those changes over time.
I basically agree with Steve and Jacqueline. We could have this series of conferences with the invited guests would be very inclusive from all stakeholders, and we could start with a template because a lot of work has been done on this. Lenny Jason is not, of course, his work, but the Canadian consensus criteria. We could look at the ICC, and we can work from that and tease out what we want, but everyone would have a say on it. But we could work with that template, and I think that would be a good start.
So what's our steps to get it so that it's widely accepted by around the country?
Well, wouldn't that be discussed at the conferences?
Yeah, I think maybe we're missing a few steps here.
Yeah, I think so.
We're jumping to the end.
Right. And how do we get there?
So let me back up a little bit and try to frame what I think I'm hearing, because we're hearing a lot of very good things here. So we've talked about engaging, and in particular, engaging those physician groups. So I think one of our subcommittees perhaps needs to take on as a goal for next time to try to figure out how do we engage those physician groups and come up with a plan for that. The second thing that we need to come up with a plan for is a list of the data to be considered, because in order for this to be a useful exercise at the end of the day for clinical trials, as Armia said, it has to be a data-driven exercise. It can't be what someone feels the criteria should be. It has to be data-driven. So we need to figure out what data are we going to use to drive the exercise. And it may be that we don't have all that data yet, but we know where it's coming from. So another subcommittee exercise could be to figure out a list of the data that we're going to use to drive this. And then the third piece that we need to come up with, I think we've heard very strongly from this group, appropriately so, that we have a number of definitions floating out there, and we need to figure out which of them are we going to put forward for consideration in this data-driven exercise. And once we have those three pieces in place, then we have the makings of a conference that could begin to work on this process. And things always work better face-to-face in terms of starting a process, but then we can use the suggestions to make the process go forward using perhaps a web-driven, some other mechanism that's not quite as labor and dollar intensive to let the process move forward, because there will be a lot of work in taking that data, applying it, and figure out what's going to work best in a research project. And at the end of the day, you come up with something that hopefully, because all of these groups have worked on it, you have some consensus in what people are going to use doing research. And as a side effect, we may come up with a couple of good things. We may come up with a new name, if we have that in the back of our minds. And more importantly, we may get some other researchers excited about this. If we're engaging the societies and they're actively putting resources into coming up with definitions, they're going to want to use them. Wouldn't that be great? Just some thoughts.
Thank you, Terry. And one of the things I would like by the next meeting, actually, to have our subcommittees have already started working with and reaching out. I think we have plenty of time. And I think it's probably a good idea to use both subcommittees, because we have clinicians on both subcommittees and other people who have contacts with and affiliations with various and sundry groups. And we could give people tasks to go meet with their leadership. Much of the leadership for the clinical physician groups are here in D.C., Chicago, probably New York. So they're in a few locations. We could also use our colleagues on the other side of that table over there, and they can begin reaching out. But we need to have it coordinated like that. So, Steve.
If we're going to reach out, I would propose that we start with the ME definition that is proposed in Jason's article as a starting point. And that's what we reach out with, get feedback on that and work off that. Because if otherwise, it's too mushy. Okay. And I don't know that, when I read his article, he convinced me that his definition was better than the Canadian one. Okay. rightly or wrongly. I mean, we could pick the Canadian one and do it, but it's just some place to start that is more tangible than nothing.
Or go to these groups, educate them, because we've already heard that there's a lot of misinformation even among the leadership of these primary care groups around CFS. So educate them to the problem and to our goal of coming up with a good, useful definition.
Well, one doesn't exclude the other.
Right,
But the problem is that unless we pick one to start with and to talk about as our starting point, we're not going to do any better than has been done the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah. Mary Ann.
We're leaving out one group.
Okay.
That's the ICFS,
Okay.
which is the International Association of Researchers in Chronic Fatigue Syndrome /ME.
Right. And they were invited today, but were not able to come today.
That group is the most knowledgeable. And I can tell you that the American Medical Association is not going to be particularly well informed.
But isn't that,
on this.
to get this to be widely used around the country, isn't that the very sort of groups we've got to get? We've got to get them here.
I don't think you'll ever get them.
Huh? Can't get them if we don't start trying.
I think it's important that the
20
criteria be accurate and be scientifically based. And people who haven't been working it, how are they going to weigh in on a criterion when they're not the experts on it? They haven't been working in it. Do you understand what I'm saying? I mean, you can get all the stakeholders. If the stakeholders don't know anything, how can they add anything informative if they haven't been working with the program, with the problem, if they haven't been involved in it, don't have experience in it? How are they going to contribute to the criterion?
The one thing I want to say is the thing that Susan started off with was two definitions.
Right. Should get it back.
So we have a research definition and we have a clinical definitions, and I hear over and over and over again how people with ME/CFS go for many physicians before they find one that can figure it out. So we need to get the primary care physicians on board for at least the clinical definition. And then if we have the thing like, the top the 4 out of the following 8, then people can begin to do that. And I think we have to bring some of those people at the table.
I think what you were saying is echoing the sort of catch-22 that I had raised and Eileen referred to, was exactly the point that I was making, that I completely understand the importance of buy-in, at the same time to ask people who know nothing about the condition to weigh in on a case definition for a condition that they're not familiar with.
Well, so maybe there's 2 meetings. Maybe there's the meeting where we come up with a case definition, and then we have another conference where we bring representatives from the clinical community to educate them and get their input. So, Dane.
So, I want to go on record saying I'm against reinventing the wheel here, but I'd like to ask Ermias and Teresa what they mean by it has to be data-driven. If we're going to, there are many case definitions out there. I don't think it's a good use of the committee's time to try to create a new one.
I'm not.
But your comment there suggested that we're going to go and try to get consensus on a definition by. So, can I ask what you meant by data-driven?
Yes, I think any case definition, existing or new, should be able to be backed up by data that would, for example, try to calculate what's the specificity of that particular case definition compared to a physician diagnosis. In other words, you should have some sets of parameters for you to be able to evaluate.
Well, this part I understand, but are you?
That's basically.
Are we going backwards to look at old data, or are we going forward and collecting new data?
It could be either one, as long as that data is useful. In other words.
So if we go forward and collecting new data, we're talking a very long process.
Now,
if we go backwards to look at old data, all we're doing is looking at the Fukuda case definition. That's it.
Now,
because that is the only criteria that's been used in 99% of the research.
when I say data, is data that's not specifically, for example, a good example that I can use is the data that we're collecting in the 7 clinics, okay? Because the data that's being collected in the 7 clinics does not specify any case definition. It's just the best judgment of the physicians who have treated chronic fatigue syndrome patients for years and years, using their best judgment, what are the cases that they would classify as having CFS, and collecting as many parameters as possible that would allow us then to apply to those case definitions and see how those case definitions actually fare.
This, to me, this prospective approach is the most powerful way to go then.
When will those data be ready?
They've started collecting the data, but I can't give you a date because it's dependent on those physicians, not us at CDC. But some of the sites have already started enrolling patients, and we're shooting for about probably 400 patients eventually to be enrolled. And if that happens within the next, let's say, 12 to 16 or 18 months, that would be great.
But do you see the limitation that I saw of our initial conversation is that if we look backwards, as Lenny's work has done, and the big limitation is that all the studies and all the research that they're basing the definition on use the Fukuda criteria as an entry criteria for all the patients. It's totally flawed to then try to say that this is an ME group versus a CFS group versus an ME plus CFS group or whatever. It's very limited, but a prospective way that is blind to, that doesn't subscribe to a certain definition up front and then apply criteria, that is the way that is less limited.
The problem is you still have to identify the patients ahead of time.
Which
the clinicians.
The clinicians make that decision. We are using their best judgment.
Yes. So there are no criteria then.
Right.
That's not going to work real well. I mean, what?
I don't understand. I don't understand.
Steve, it might work. These are researchers. They've been thinking about this for 25 years.
A lot of us also have been, and that's not the.
Well, Nancy Klimas is one of the PIs.
One of the people in the study, yes, but she never intended it, I don't think, to result in a new case definition.
So should we just give this up and not worry about moving forward on the case definition?
I have a question, but I didn't understand exactly what you said. Just clarify for me so I don't lose the rest of the discussion. The 5 centers, the 5 places, did you say to the investigators, do collect the data and the data set is up to you to use whatever criteria is out there? Are they naming that criteria?
We basically left it to them to make that decision. We're using their best judgment. We don't want to box them into a case definition. For example,
do you think they'll be able to go back to how they made that decision and say, I used such and such criteria?
They should be able to.
Remember, the Fukuda was a research definition, and this is a clinical study.
So, in other words, do they have a criteria? Do they know what criteria they're using, or they make blending them? I'm not sure. I don't understand.
We have to trust physicians at one point. And these are physicians who have a lot of experience dealing with CFS for years and years and years. Mm-hmm. So if we take Dr. Klimas, if Dr. Klimas says from her judgment and her practice, in whatever criteria she uses, that particular patient is a CFS patient, we're going to include it in the study.
I can tell you for sure what Nancy Klimas uses on all the patients that we put into a research study. And that is, now she uses the Canadian. Before that, she used the Fukuda. And I can also say that Reeves did a lot of damage when he and the CDC made that revision of the Fukuda that opened up the case definition to a whole lot of people with depression. And so we have to be really careful about this kind of thing, it could be really damaging.
The one thing is that it may be that it's not the research definition that Dr. Klimas is using, but who she is treating for for chronic fatigue syndrome in her practice, and who she says to them, to the patient, that you have CFS.
Well, that's what she uses to say that to them. She wouldn't want to say to a patient that you have chronic fatigue syndrome if they didn't meet some definition. And
Jordan, we're going to need to round this up because we do need to keep going.
I just wanted to, the way I understand this, and I still want to say that there is a lot of value and merit to the study that the CDC is obviously doing. I don't work for the CDC, but the way I understand it is that you actually ask people using their best judgment to say whether someone actually has or doesn't have chronic fatigue syndrome /ME, and then they still collect a uniform set of symptoms from those patients, which eventually you want to use in a data-driven approach to go back and say, out of all those 7 centers, the core symptoms that characterize this condition are fatigue, this and this and this, and then redefine the disease using this way.
That's exactly right.
And I think that's actually what we're trying to accomplish, as far as I understand.
I'm sorry for my ignorance, but I just want to make sure I understand. So you're not asking the investigators of those 5 places to decide on what criteria they're using. You're saying pick your patients, collect their symptoms, and never reveal what criteria they based it on, or I'm not. They do know what criteria they're using. In other words, right? Is that okay?
It's implied, I guess.
I think if we want to move on to our big discussion, this is a big issue, and we only had an hour for it. We took a little more than an hour, Well, I think what we need to do is to continue this discussion over the phone, and what I may do is propose some action steps for the subcommittees, and we can see what people think.
I thought that Elaine, or that is the website she gave us this morning about with the coding, right? Do we have access to the 787? In other words, it would be interesting to find out which providers submitted, bills to Medicare with the chronic fatigue code, and somehow would we ever be able to tell whether they were primary care providers or specialists? In other words, do you know what I'm saying? You said that there was some kind of coding data available to us. Oh.
I think getting into that level of specificity in the data might be very challenging. I don't know for sure. Okay. The other thing is the point that Dane raised. If we look back and use old data, then I think you run into the issue that he raised. One last thing.
Yeah.
We're going to move to the next.
No, I think what CDC is doing is the right way to go about it, because fibromyalgia started out, they got a bunch of people who were diagnosing fibromyalgia, and they collected information about them, and then they looked at the data to figure out what were the commonalities and figured out diagnostic criteria. So if I criticized you earlier, I take it back, because I think, but I still think we have to start with something to go forward with, too. And it's a longer discussion, right, and I don't want to lose the primer.
No, so now I think it's time, because we clearly, this would take, we have so many things that people want to bring to these meetings that we never can have enough time. Yeah, this is an important one, and this is why it's here. So let us, Steve, if you could speak again for yourself and for Galen about this particular recommendation, and I think Dane was the cautionary person who said we should all read it first. No, I think that's a wise person.
I have no objections to people being informed. What I would think that the appropriate step to take with this is, I did look on the website, and they have two things on the website. One, it's free. They ask you to make a little donation, but it's not required. And secondly, in their terms of use, they want it widely distributed. So my motion would be to have this primer, I would recommend that this primer be adopted in lieu of the toolkit by the CDC, providing we get agreement from the IACF or the authors or whoever we have to do it with it, and that this primer, we work to widely distribute this primer to the primary care physicians. That would be my motion.
Do I have a second? Okay,
Yes.
Mary Ann seconds it, okay. It's open for discussion.
Let's call the question.
Is that what you, I'm very bad at Robert's Rules of Order.
I would like to call the question
So what does
unless
that mean?
there's
Is
discussion.
that a vote? Well,
yeah, to vote, but it looks like
I think we have
Deborah.
a question. I'm terrible at Robert's Rules of Order.
So I'd just like to say that I really appreciated the previous discussion because it really does relate to this issue of the primer, and that is that what we ultimately want is to have a common conversation, and we want to be able to, I personally engage as many primary care providers and others as possible in the process of caring for patients with this disorder. That said, traditionally, from the government's side, as obstructive as it may appear to some, we also defer to professional societies and health professional organizations to determine care and treatment algorithms and patterns. The government doesn't dictate that to healthcare providers. What we do is, in some cases, we actually support guidelines development. In the case of HIV, I believe is one, and maybe a few others where we actually, but what we do is then bring those expert clinicians together and let them hash it out, and then they tell us what they want to do, and we say thank you. So the process is very similar to the one that you were talking about with respect to the name. It's once again engaging those health professionals in a longitudinal educational process over time, where you're bringing them to the table to hash out their best approach to whatever it is, and to look at the data and the information that we have before us with their recommendations. So I hear you, and I would love, and I'm going to make copies for myself, and I'm going to try to figure out, as a clinician, how to use this. But when it comes to the government and distributing something, endorsing it, whatever, it's a little bit more difficult, and so that's why we're here to figure it out together.
I wasn't suggesting that the government go to the print shop and print 1 million copies of this, although if that makes sense, I think how it's distributed and where it's distributed is not necessarily our decision here. But it is a good basic document that gives a primary care physician a real roadmap, whether it is the differential diagnosis to consider or whether it's different treatment options to consider, and there's nothing like it anywhere else. And there have been concerns about the toolkit, and I know Ermias would be in a process of rewriting it, but I don't know, with all due respect to the CDC, if they could do a much better job than this is right now. And that's why I make the proposal.
Someone yesterday, one of my federal colleagues here talked about guidelines.gov. Would this be, there's a problem that we have in the federal government in general about seemingly endorsing something over something else that is not produced by ourselves. Guidelines.gov is something from AHRQ that puts everybody's guidelines out there. This is a little more than a guideline, but I'm just wondering if this would be appropriate to be able to, and that's a way we can link, as a federal agencies, we can link to outside guidelines.
That's a good point, Nancy, because I'm sitting here getting very nervous about how this would likely be unsuccessful. It's a non-starter, actually, for the government to be able to endorse it. It just
not what we do.
It doesn't.
Well, we're an advisory
work.
committee. Can't we endorse it and
Sure.
recommend that the government implement it?
But then we'll be unsuccessful, and then next meeting you'll all come and criticize that we didn't do that because we're not able to do that.
You can endorse it.
But we can't implement it or enforce it or regulate it.
Or endorse it, yeah.
Unless the CDC adopted it as their toolkit.
And in order to do that, I shouldn't speak on behalf of the CDC, but in order to do that, there would be a lengthy review clearance process.
So what about guidelines.gov?
So guidelines.gov, because I don't like being the naysayer, but it's the reality. Guidelines.gov, however, is a nice idea, I think. It is a clearinghouse for clinical guidelines. There's also one for innovations. There's also one for quality measures. And it is a clearinghouse where guidelines are posted. The nice thing about it is that there's an editorial board, independent editorial board, and there is a standard for the quality of guidelines, so that in order to be listed there, you would have to meet quality standards, so that when you go to look for guidelines or clinical guidance, that you could be assured that there was a standard of quality for
it
that.
has a very nice search function. There's
Yes.
a comparison function.
So what's the process, though? I mean,
You simply, as an organization, the IACFS would submit this document.
why can't we submit it?
Well, you can't. Well, as the authors of this, they should do that. They own it.
No, they publish it. In the legal world, when somebody says you can download it, you can print it, and we want it widely distributed, they have no copyright right in that at all.
So one thing is that this committee could recommend.
That's all I'm asking.
Yeah, could
We can only
recommend
recommend.
that the organization. Well, again, you can't recommend them, but that this document be included in
Right.
guidelines.gov.
But the secretary wouldn't nominate it, or
Right.
Well,
I mean, you could make that recommendation, and then we could work.
The recommendation that I would like to make is that the secretary authorize the appropriate person in HHS to work with the IACFS to make this widely available to primary care providers.
Could I ask a historical question? In the HIV world, someone made the decision, and it was widely then used around the world, that what constituted HIV infection and what constituted AIDS, the clinical classification of AIDS, was that the government?
It was probably a consortium. No, it was probably.
I think it was.
I think it was probably, knowing how the government works, it was probably some of the government, and then they took the AIDS, the people who were taking care of people with AIDS around the country, around the world, and they brought them all in, and they.
Now, it
set
happened
it
pretty
together.
damn fast, so I don't think.
I don't know the answer to your question, but
Yeah.
just knowing how the government works, they wouldn't have done it without the clinic. Because there aren't very many clinicians that work in the government, so we don't have a lot of patients, and so we would work with people
But I don't
who know
think they
them.
called in the American Medical Association or the Internal
I don't know what they
Medicine
call.
Association.
But does this have to do with?
Well, it has to do with with a case definition.
Well,
That was a
but I
case
think-
definition.
Basically, what we do is we engage the clinical community and the clinical societies that are involved, and we get their best knowledge. And so it would have involved lots of, as was just said, clinicians that were actually doing, had on hands patient care at the time, pulling their best knowledge together. That may be what it was just said was that's what the IACFS is. The clinical community that's engaged and involved with care of patients with chronic fatigue certainly would be a similar community, I suppose. But the specialties, the primary care providers didn't have, how do I put it? Traditionally the approach is to bring in as many people as possible to the table to have that conversation. And as I had explained earlier with HIV, we had a lot of political pressure to act quickly, and people were dying. And as a matter of fact, over a number of years, there were clinicians that were actually caring for patients and sending information, sort of sharing information about what they were seeing, sort of online, sort of real time, to learn as quickly as possible what would work and what wouldn't work. So we could maybe go through the history of HIV and how it became. And actually, we know some of those people.
Yeah, I
still
think that's
exist.
a good, especially when we're talking about the case definition. I think that's a good
That's
thing to
actually not
review.
a bad
And
But we're not talking about the case definition. We're talking about
getting
a primer
intermixed.
that can help primary care physicians care for these patients almost immediately.
Okay, so right now I have a motion on the table, and it may have been that the wording has changed a bit, to authorize the appropriate person within HHS to work with IACFS-ME to make the primer available, widely available.
Widely available, particularly to primary care providers.
Okay. So, and I think we had that seconded, and Jacqueline has a question.
I have a question. For the treatment section of the primer, first of all, the primer is excellent. I mean, it really should be a chapter in Harrison's internal medicine.
Maybe it will be.
Book. But I have a question about the treatment. And for treatment of myalgic encephalitis, there aren't a whole lot of studies and proof and evidence and that kind of thing. One statement here is made about Immunivir. It may be helpful in selected patients, but there's no reference to a study or anything like that. It just says specialist advice may be in order. Clinical experience is limited. Well, I'm sorry. Everybody's clinical experience is going to be limited because there aren't, I could probably name on one hand the number of people using Immunivir. And same thing for some of these supplement and other recommendations. There isn't a series of replicated studies to show benefit with those treatments. So my question is, can we should it be recommended the treatments this detailed on an official site, like they want it to be on the CDC site, or as an official something officially recommended by the government or by the Department of Health
and that's what we were
Services?
trying to get to earlier. Is we have great difficulty with that sort of thing, but that's the beauty of guidelines.gov.
Mhm.
Is it's a different purpose. So you could put it on guidelines.gov if it met the sort of editorial, and I guess it's a little more than editorial. It sounds like this document would probably meet it if it were in the right. But to go on our website or CDC's would be more problematic, which is why we just, as Deborah said, it would be a non-starter. Yeah, Dane.
I think Jacqueline brings up a good point. And is it possible for us as subcommittees then to meet, review, and make recommendations to IACFS on modifications to it before we fully endorse it?
Well, I don't think
mean, I think
that
that's
was a
useful if you-
recommendation, and the thing, the way I read it it said some physicians use those substances.
Well, that doesn't
It
mean
doesn't
that
mean
someone
they're
on this.
recommended. In fact, it said in there
Get
that
a
you should
specialist.
seek expert advice before doing it.
There are, and that's one interpretation of that. But you can also criticize them for not providing more detail on that, or asking them if you're unable to. That's fine. But there's nothing wrong with making recommendations to things that you're unclear about. What's that?
It's going to end up with this document not being circulated in a timely way.
I disagree. I think the subcommittees can get together, and we've all worked well together in the past, and come up with a set of what we feel are maybe we won't come up with a set that we feel are important enough for them to make recommendations at all. But I mean, I hate to be the cautionary tale here, but I've read it twice now, and I came up with new things a second time. So
Could I just throw in a thought about that? This is Celine Perry. It does say, one little touch on here that I thought was good was that it says 2012 edition, which to me implies that there could be a 2013 or a 2014, or at least that it would be updated on a regular basis. So to me, it seems that it could be possible for the committee to choose to endorse dissemination of the current version without fully endorsing the complete content. And the committee could decide that, this is worth disseminating at this point, and then perhaps make recommendations for further changes for a future edition. That could be one solution.
I think that's a good solution.
My goal is to get this out so that primary care providers can have more information and understanding it. And this is the best thing I've seen in years to do that. I am not a clinician, and there will be treatment options. And as sure as we're sitting here, there are going to be changes to this. But I think the message ought to be, and the recommendation is, from my perspective, to have this circulated to primary care physicians and to work with the IACFS or the authors or whoever we have to work with to help facilitate that. And if facilitating that means it should be on the guide, whatever that place is, great. If it means that we should send it to the heads of the different organizations to distribute to their members on behalf of IACFS or on the behalf of the CFSAC, great. But it's not the be all and the end all, but it sure is a good beginning.
Thank you for that clarification, because I think that's helpful. Initially, it sounded a little more prescriptive than I'm understanding it now. So, thanks.
You're welcome.
We're getting to the point where people are.
We need a quorum.
Yeah. So let us. Because I still hear a little bit of.
Can we call the question?
Yeah,
and just see where
that's
we
what
are?
I'm thinking, and I want to read what we have, and if Steve, if this doesn't capture,
I'll.
Right. So it's authorize the appropriate and this will be for a recommendation to the secretary.
We recommend.
Yes. We can get that part. Authorize the appropriate person within HHS to work with IACFSME to make the primer available, widely available, particularly to primary care providers. Is that good for you? So I think we have a second to that motion already.
We did.
I'm really sorry, but could you repeat it?
Okay, yes. Authorize the appropriate person within HHS to work with IACFSME to make the primer widely available, particularly to primary care providers.
It sounds good. And when you say particularly, meaning that's open-ended in case we want to add specialties?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
no,
good.
I think that's what it.
Right.
But that means, like your first target audience
Your first
is.
target, and then
But
rheumatologist,
it's
urologist.
not exclusionary. That's how I would read that. Oh, I think that's it. So we're calling the question. So all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Or raise your hands. Yeah. All opposed? I see. You haven't read it, okay. So I would, and then we don't have voting from, I thought we had voting from the, yeah, what do I know? I get so, all right. So, good. So I think we have, everybody has voted on that one. So that will be a recommendation.
Great.
Good.